The year is 1272, and outside a small church in northern England, a crowd has gathered. Masons are putting the finishing touches on a new extension to the church, and the assembled crowd peers through the final few holes left in the stone wall they're building. Through these holes, they can see a young woman, sitting on a rough wooden bed, clasping her hands together in prayer. Finally, the Masons insert the last stone into place, and the woman is sealed away, never to feel the warmth of the sun on her skin or the warmth of a loved one's embrace ever again. She will live out her life and die in the tiny room she has just been entombed within. But what might be most shocking of all is the fact that this isn't a punishment. In fact, it's an honor. And it's an honor that the young woman has chosen for herself. Anchorites were a religious group that grew in popularity during the Middle to Late Middle Ages. And while they attracted both men and women, they were predominantly female, with as many as twice as many women as men becoming anchorites. These pious men and women dedicated their life wholeheartedly to God, and more specifically to prayer for the salvation of the world. And the best way to accomplish this in their minds was to seal themselves away where they could not be tempted or led astray from their path. It's believed that John the Baptist served as the inspiration for the Anchorite way of life, as he was a hermit monk who retreated from the world so that he may come closer to God. For his faith and devotion, God rewarded him with the privilege of preparing others for the coming of Jesus, and ultimately with the baptism of Jesus himself, as the latter began his earthly ministry. Yet, while John the Baptist was a famous hermit, he wasn't a recluse by any means, and certainly did not go to the extreme lengths that Anchorites did. Hermitdom was also popular during the time of Anchorites, and for much the same reason as John the Baptist's. Becoming a hermit was a way of leaving the world behind and enduring a life of hardship in a bid to become closer to God. Unlike today, where we consider hermits to be creepy weirdos, hermits were largely honored during the Middle Ages, as their seclusion was seen as an act of pious devotion to God. Hermits were often sought out for their spiritual wisdom and counsel, and received some level of honor rather than disdain. For some, hermitdom was too easy a path to follow, and these people decided that they needed a more extreme form of social isolation in order to get closer to God. To become an anchorite, an individual needed to get the cooperation of the church, as their cell where they would spend the rest of their life needed to be constructed on the side of a church, where they could still be close to the religious services. The anchorite had to prove to the bishop of the church that they were capable of supporting themselves for a number of years and had the services of at least one servant to bring them food and water, as well as remove their waste. This has led modern researchers to puzzle over the practice, as it's clear that only educated, financially well-to-do individuals could afford to engage in such a lifestyle. And these aren't the type of people whose lives are so difficult that they might seek to escape them by any means necessary. This is evidence that the life of an anchorite was not just chosen by those who participated, but even desired, bizarre as that might seem to us today. Once entombed, the anchorite was forbidden from ever leaving their enclosure, and given that there was no doorway and they were surrounded in solid stone, escape was a moot point. The only openings to the outside world were 2 to 3 slits cut in the rock. One slit would face into the church from where the anchorite could see the altar and could partake in Mass. Another slit would face outwards, from which the anchorite could receive visitors. Sometimes a third slit was cut for the anchorite to receive food and water and to pass their waste to a servant on the outside. The interior of the cell contained only sparse and very rough wooden furnishings, typically just a rough cot to sleep on, a desk, and possibly a chest or a set of drawers. Fresh hay may have been shoved through the slit for the anchorite to make a bed with, but that was the extent of comfort for the imprisoned. In fact, the more difficult the living conditions, the more holy the experience was considered, and anchorites often actively strove for discomfort in order to bring themselves closer to God. The interior of the cell was typically about 12 square feet, or the size of a small bedroom. There was no bathroom, largely because this was the Middle Ages and the anchorite would have to make use of a bucket, living with their waste until it was collected by a servant on the outside. In summer months with sweltering heat, the cell provided little to no relief from breezes, as the slits cut into the chamber were far too small to allow for airflow. The insufferable heat must have only been worsened by the stench from the anchorite's waste and their own body, as anchorites would be unable to bathe. Some anchorites did include additional furnishings so that they could pursue a trade craft while being entombed. One famous anchorite was a renowned goldsmith and worked with raw ore brought to him, crafting it into jewelry and holy symbols. These would have been the times version of a Louis Vuitton bag today, as anchorites were that highly renowned, and wearing an item crafted by one would have been a great honor. For this reason, anchorites' guidebooks encouraged them to limit their crafting or sewing to simple, modest items, as the celebrity of these figures was well known. Celebrity was itself a bit of a problem for the anchorite, and despite being able to receive visitors through the slit in their cell, they were expressly discouraged from doing so.
Anchorite guidebooks warned that anchorites were to limit the time spent with visitors to a minimum, and churches were instructed to forbid the gathering of large groups of visitors.
While anchorites were highly sought after for spiritual guidance and religious advice, they were discouraged from spending their time chatting away, as they were supposed to focus on prayer and religious study instead. Celebrities though they were, and despite being extreme recluses, anchorites were highly honored within the church. In a society where women held little to no power, women anchorites who outnumbered men by as much as 2 to 1 were seen as the highest spiritual authority within their church, even higher than the bishop himself. Their wisdom was even sought after by nobles and even kings and queens. Some modern researchers postulate that women chose to become anchorites so that they could escape the social oppression of the day and receive prestige and honor in a world where they would have otherwise been nothing much more than a wife, expected to rear and raise children. Some in fact believe that the life of an anchorite was so popular with women because they sought it as a means of escaping forced marriages. The term anchorite is believed to have originated from the prestige afforded to these solitaries, as their wisdom and piety was believed to be the literal anchor of the church. Dedicating their lives wholeheartedly to prayer, these men and women were thought to be immune to worldly temptations and deceits, and thus could steer a church through troublesome periods by being its spiritual anchor. This was a role taken extremely seriously by the anchorite, with part of their motivation for entombment being a need to pray for the sins of the world. By dedicating themselves to praying for the world, the anchorite hoped to intercede between God's judgment and a wicked world, and the anchorite would spend much of their time in supplication for God's mercy. The family and friends of an anchorite were encouraged to consider their loved one to be dead, and in fact they were legally considered as such. As the final stones were laid into place in an anchorite cell, the priest would deliver final rites, the prayers which were said at a person's funeral. Their earthly lives were over, and now were given over for prayer to God until the day they died. With so few visitors though, an anchorite might die without anyone noticing except for their assigned servant, and last rites seemed a bit practical as well as ceremonial. It's not known what anchorites felt about their way of life, if they had any regrets over their entombing, or if they gladly accepted such an extreme lifestyle. The only surviving text from an anchoress is that of Julian of Norwich, an anchorite that lived in the late 1300s. The only reference to her personal feelings on her lifestyle is a small comment which reads, "This place is a prison, this life is a penance." Whether Julian was referring to the earth as a prison and our earthly lives as penance, or her actual life entombed next to a church, is unknown. Anchorites were nothing if not stoic. It wouldn't matter much if an anchorite did experience a change of heart anyways, as the church would never allow them to be freed. Anchorism was a deadly serious commitment, and there was no option to fail. That being said, some anchorites did eventually attempt to escape with the help of outsiders. Yet for some, anchorism was not extreme enough, and another group, known as the Stylites, had for a long time been engaging in an even more extreme lifestyle choice. Stylites get their name from the word stylos, which means pillar, and from their habit of living out their lives entirely sitting atop stone pillars, exposed to the elements on a tiny platform. Stylites vowed to spend their entire lives perched atop stone pillars and endure extreme hardship for the sake of closeness to God. Much like anchorites, Stylites were also greatly honored, and one in particular, Saint Daniel the Stylite, even received royal visitors who sought out his wisdom. Perched atop a pillar built especially for him outside Constantinople by Emperor Leo I, Saint Daniel gave counsel to Emperors Leo and Zeno of Constantinople, as well as the city's patriarch. He regularly held sermons and counseled the faithful, partaking in the Eucharist and even, it's claimed, healing the sick. It's said he came down from his pillar only once in 33 years to turn Emperor Beliscus away from Monophysitism, a blasphemous belief that Jesus Christ was not God himself in human flesh, but was entirely God and had no human nature. For Christians, the belief that Jesus was both part human and part divine is a point of great comfort, as it inspires them to believe in a Savior that endured the same hardships and temptations with the same human frailty that normal people do, and yet triumphed over them. Turning away to the blasphemy of Monophysitism would likely be an excuse for St. Daniel to abandon his perch briefly, but we bet getting the chance to stretch his legs must have felt amazing. The life of an anchorite or a stylite couldn't have been an easy one. And while this seems insane to us today, and there's no mention in the Bible of any of these practices being necessary at all, one can't help but admire the conviction and personal discipline it must have taken to live out a life of extreme solitude, and the selflessness of dedicating oneself to a life of prayer for the world. Next time you're in your room at home and the internet goes out, close your eyes for a moment and imagine that you now have to spend the rest of your life in that room with no entertainment, no bathroom breaks, and no human contact. Want to hear more stories about religion? Check out our video, Where Could the Ark of the Covenant Be? Or check out this other video instead.